Social norms are just harmful, and the system enforces them as a way for it to continue existing, not because it's individually beneficial to specific people within that system. So dismantling the system is to the benefit of everybody. So I wasn't planning on making this video early on, but in reflecting on a previous video I did, my first one, which is what therapy with Come Together Counseling or Me is like, which will be somewhere. Um, I realized that I said something which could be potentially harmful, and so I wanted to reflect on what I said and why it's harmful, and so I'll be getting into that. I think also moving forward, I would like to establish a practice of being able to reflect on previous videos. Obviously, there will be things that come up after the video's out that I couldn't have anticipated or that other people see that I didn't see, or even things that I just think about differently later. So I do want to establish this sort of like self-reflective process. If you are watching my videos and you see something that you don't quite agree with or something that maybe I missed something, please let me know, because that sort of gives me the opportunity to come back to it if that feels like a good fit. So, yeah, so, okay, what am I returning to exactly? Um, that first video, I talked about this idea, or I talked about people being normal or ordinary within the context of um, being in inpatient facilities. So, in the Rosenhan study, people um, people who had um, been participants in this study, they acted as if they had certain mental health symptoms, and then they stopped acting that way. They acted how they ordinarily would act in a different context. Um, and I think the use of normal or ordinary in this way, like I sort of was like, oh, if people are normal or ordinary, they wouldn't be here, which implies that if people are abnormal or not ordinary in some way, that they might belong there, which I don't believe. Um, there, this idea of what is or is not normal is used by systems of control within society to not just around discourse around like, oh, you're not supposed to be that way, you should be like this way instead, in the way people talk, but also specifically in the way that people are policed, in the way that different systems will punish people for not being normal or ordinary. So I'm going to give you a few examples using myself as an example, and then I'm going to return to people experiencing mental distress, talk about why that's specifically harmful in this context, and then I'm going to talk about how social norms are just harmful, period. Okay, so first let me use myself as an example. So one of my identities is I am non-binary. Non-binary is by definition not normal. The normal is the gender binary of you're either supposed to be a man or a woman, male or female. Um, and I'll leave the complicated gender theory stuff for later. For right now, just talking about the way that normal is policed. There's a few different ways that normal is policed. One is the gatekeeping of medical procedures. So um, it could be so easy to receive hormone blockers or hormone treatments as you walk into CVS and pick it up off the counter. It could be that easy. Instead, often people have to go talking to different professionals, receiving letters of approval. It can be extremely expensive to receive, and that's just like hormones or blockers. A lot of surgeries, which are like necessary for people to survive, are not covered in the United States. And I don't know about the situation in other countries. I would assume um, it's still not as easy as it could be. I think ideally people can receive whatever medical care that they themselves are saying is necessary for their survival, with consulting with a doctor if they, believe that's necessary. So the medical gatekeeping literally kills trans people. Um, and that's because we're viewed as not normal, and our bodies, our literal bodies, are policed to be normal. So that's one example, and tying in with that example is, in the news recently, there's been these laws in Texas and also, I believe, maybe Idaho, some other places where it's child abuse to treat trans young people with the care and respect of, believing them and getting them treatment that they're asking for. Potentially charging families with child abuse or child neglect. So this is a way in which child protective services, social service workers, like myself, are used as tools of the state as police. Um, with the end result of, trans people are not going to not be trans. People are going to commit suicide. People are going to leave the state. People are going to, you know, be quiet and try to keep those things locked up inside and suffer a lot as a result. So when we try to police and say, well, you're not normal, you shouldn't be this way, that so much harm comes from that. Um, so the third example for um, being not normal and being non-binary is literal physical violence, either by police or by just homophobic, transphobic people. There is the one example of sending people into a jail that they is the wrong gender. I think, you know, sending people to jail, period, is violent and harmful, but certainly putting people in the jail of a gender that they visibly don't conform to could lead to further harm. Um, and then also there's the ways that police are violent towards people specifically because they can understand them as queer, trans, or non-binary. So those are a few ways in which normal is policed when it comes to gender. I also wanted to talk about non-monogamy, which is not often viewed as an axis of oppression, and I'm not like saying that it needs to be viewed that way. But what I would say is that society does present monogamy and attached to that the family, nuclear family structure as normal, and it polices in such a way to create that sense of normal. How does it do that? Well, one example is that it's very difficult to raise young people in a non like two parent or even like a biological lineage sort of way. So you for instance cannot share like legal rights to make decisions about young people with other adults if they're not, monogamous. Um, so that can lead to all sorts of problems. There's also health insurance coverage. Again, because we have a private health insurance system, people cannot share their coverage with people that they're in relationships with unless there's some legal basis to that relationship, whether that's like your siblings or you're married. So if you have, multiple partners, and it's in many places not legal to have multiple partners, um, you can't, share your health coverage with them. So um, that's obviously harmful. Everyone deserves health coverage, the right to life. Um, Also, a little more abstract, but also like very not abstract, is the way our homes, our cities, our public spaces are structured is not set up for people to be able to share in non-monogamous community. Like our homes are sort of set up for the nuclear family structure. You have like the master bedroom, um, which I don't know the historical origins of that term, but don't like it. Um, and then you have smaller bedrooms, presumably for children, and then also you have homes which are like sort of atomized or separated from each other when, in terms of building community with peers, some form of like physical connection present in our spaces would help for us to connect with each other. Whether that's like more bedrooms of equivalent sizes, whether that's um, like better soundproofing so that it doesn't stink to have like super close neighbors, um, different things like that, so that it's easier to actively form intimate relationships with people who are nearby. So in that way, being non-monogamous is also sort of like not normal, and it's sort of like society is structured in a way to push people towards monogamy. Um, and of course, there are many other, like you could just go down and talk about different forms of oppression and say, this is what's viewed as normal, this is what's viewed as not, and that there's like an extensive array of harms. I'm talking about ones which specifically I have personal experience with, because I feel like I could maybe talk about those a little bit more in depth. Um, but yeah, this applies in so many cases. So also I wanted to talk about how this applies specifically for people experiencing mental distress. So um, in moments of crisis, which people who have mental distress experience crisis sometimes, um, oftentimes it's police who are responding in those moments, and police, you know, only know how to escalate, only know how to, you know, view it as us versus the world. So they might act to defend themselves and thus harm the person in crisis when that person needs a calming presence to help sort of navigate that crisis. A lot of people die as a result of police interventions um, because of the police. And a lot of people who experience police violence are also people who have mental distress. Um, Obviously, police violence itself causes mental distress. So it's this like cycle, especially in over-policed neighborhoods, over-policed communities, in which people have crisis and police come and escalate that crisis, and then that leads to people having further crises down the road. Where does that cycle stop? It doesn't. So that's one example is like the very overt like policing of people who are in crisis. Um, there's also employment discrimination. This might show up as like, you have a gap in your employment history because for a time you were too distressed to work. People will be discriminated against that. People will be discriminated against for incarceration, and that's related to experiencing mental distress, having difficulties getting in trouble with the law, and that will come up in employment discrimination. Asking for accommodations. We have the Americans with Disability Act, which is supposed to give accommodations for people who need them. But especially when these accommodations are not like obvious and straightforward, like I need X, otherwise Y. You know, it can be easy for an employer to say, I don't see your issue here. Suck it up. Um, it's sort of like you need a billion forms of proof to show that you deserve accommodations rather than like everyone gets whatever accommodations they ask for because that is the right thing to do. That's typically not how it goes. So, the people experiencing mental distress, there's a lot of employment discrimination. Um, Also, one other piece I want to just mention is the policing of families or people in families who have mental distress. So, that can be the parents, people who get caught in these cycles of police violence and of distress, and also like lack of stability with work and with housing is that their children might be taken away. They might be told, for instance, you have to go to anger management, you have to go to therapy, you have to take these pills in order to keep your children, um, which, is antithetical to consent and is antithetical to those people actually like being able to make use of that. So people are policed for having distress rather than supported. People have to choose the form of support that's best for them in order to actually be able to make use of that support. Also, it can be like the young person who is the target of family policing, And in that case, there may be like behavioral specialists who come into the home who impose their form of treatment, which often can cause a lot of harm. Um, and also in the school system, there can be policing of young people in terms of experiencing mental distress that, they're not in a capability to be able to learn, but they're sort of like, you know, a situation is set up where it's like, we're going to make sure you learn, so you're going to have to do this. Um, so, yeah, I think in many different areas of life, people experiencing mental distress because they're viewed as not normal, because we've pathologized mental distress, which is a normal experience to have, um, it's viewed as not ordinary. It's viewed as something to be policed or to be removed. Um, of course, the other big example, which I forgot to mention when I was talking about policing earlier, is involuntary treatment. People being sent to the hospital against their will, people, having different people having medications against their will, people having group therapy that they don't want to be at. This is a form of policing, and it's overtly harmful. I think people like to imagine that this is helping. It's really not helping. Um, okay, so I hope this clarifies why it could have been harmful for me to talk about normal or ordinary within the context of these people who went to this inpatient facility and then they started acting like normally, because there is a range of human expression. And when we say that something is normal and something else isn't, a lot of the time people can be harmed. So everyone deserves our care, whether or not we view them as being normal enough. Um, I would say we can even do away with this idea of there needs to be a normal. So, commentary on the initial video. Um, so, some concluding thoughts. I think that social norms harm everyone, actually, not just the people who are viewed as abnormal or deviant, but they harm even the people who are viewed as normal, who have to suppress parts of themselves in order to be viewed that way, who also are dehumanized in the sense of like treating abnormal people in a way that's harmful. Like it requires some element of dehumanizing yourself to do that to someone else. Um, Also, on the subject of privilege versus oppression, because I think sometimes this conversation can be framed in that language of, certain groups have privilege and other groups are oppressed. I think this can sometimes be limiting in the sense that we view it as like a linear like number scale where like if you have X amount of privilege, you're like this way, and then you have this amount of oppression, you're like back over here, or vice versa, or like sort of like in comparison, like this person's privileged in this situation, this person's oppressed. It's a very like binary or linear sort of like understanding when um, oppressive systems harm all of us, even if like they harm us differently, or some people experience more harm in certain ways, other people experience different types of harm in other ways. Um, White supremacy is dehumanizing for white people, and it's also dehumanizing for people of color. Um, so the point I'm trying to make here is that the whole system is harmful towards everyone, even the people who within that system have a certain amount of power or privilege, you could say, um, because those social norms are just harmful, and the system enforces them as a way for it to continue existing, not because it's individually beneficial to specific people within that system. So dismantling the system is to the benefit of everybody. hope that clarifies things. Hope that's a helpful addendum to the initial video. Um, Next time, I think I'm going to continue on with making some more videos about intros to various topics to then build out from there. So, thanks to the initial people who have subscribed. I do appreciate it a lot. I'll see you around.